Welcome to Regarding Men, where we hold men in high regard and where red pill isolation comes to die. Indeed it does. So come join us, regardingmen.com/join, and join a jolly band of almost 200 men now who are at Regarding Men and having daily Zoom groups. Anyway, today, of course, I'm Tom Golden, and I have Paul Elam and Janice Fiamingo with me, as usual. Bless their pea-picking hearts. I love them both dearly. And today we have a topic of domestic violence. And Deborah Powney is with us today. And before I introduce Deborah, I want to talk a little bit about domestic violence. You know, it's a real problem. And why is it a problem? Because feminists lied to begin with. They outright lied. And, you know, we know now because they're starting to write about the early days and what happened in the early days. And just look at this little gem here. In many ways, we turned a blind eye to many women's use of violence, their drug use and alcoholism, and their often harsh and violent treatment of their own children. That's by Ellen Pence, who basically founded and created the Duluth model, if you can believe that. So what this tells us is, from the very beginning, they have ignored male victims, in fact, even ignored children being abused, in order to try and focus on women as victims. That is crazy. And that is what has taken researchers now years and years to try and battle back and figure out what the heck's really going on. Are there such a thing as male victims? And that's where Deborah Powney comes in. She did a study, a survey. The last survey she did, she was hoping to get like 300 people, 300 men to come and take the survey, right? It's about domestic violence. Guess what? She got 1,300. And the research is fascinating. We'll leave you a link. You can find out more and more about that as we go along. But now Deborah's going to take a different approach. She's going to look at coercive behavior and how it affects men. And I've seen this over and over again. As a therapist working with men for years, I saw it over and over, the way women would attack men. You know, a lot of times it wasn't just by hitting them. A lot of times it was attacking their identity. It was trying to coerce them with things like sex. It was trying to coerce them with things like violence, like throwing things, not at him maybe, all kinds of things. And Deborah's latest survey is really going to have at trying to help us understand what that's all about. And Deborah is a fascinating combination. She is a PhD candidate and is a researcher, and B, a victim of domestic violence, and C, of course, a woman. So she is a really interesting blend. And Deborah, welcome today, and thank you for joining us.
No, it's an absolute pleasure, and thank you for this opportunity to discuss the data. Yeah, we were saying previously that I'm a bit of an anomaly for the feminist mantra, because I should be a poster child for their campaigns as a woman who's been a victim of male perpetrated domestic abuse. But actually, I don't think the feminist narrative helps anyone, including women.
Right.
I think, if anything, it puts women in such a Kafka trap, because the mantra, certainly in the UK, and I imagine it's identical in the States, is that men perpetrate domestic abuse against women because they are women. So that immediately puts women in a victim status by an accident of birth. And I don't claim to speak to all women, but certainly the women I know and spend time with, there's not one victim amongst them. So it's so there's that element of it, but also you were saying about children there, and what Ellen Pence said, which is completely in line with what Erin Pitsey says about the violent women that were in the shelter. And she was telling me that they used to make these little cardboard signs to put around the children's neck that said, "Don't hit me," so that when their violent mothers went to hit them, they could have an actual visual reminder not to hit the child.
Wow.
But this is, children and men have been used as collateral damage to support a flawed ideology.
Perfectly said.
And when like a lot of people, I went into psychology because of the experience I'd had in my first marriage, and I didn't have the view of men that the feminist model uses as propaganda. I just wanted to find out a few answers about how I got myself in that situation, and I didn't fit the template of a broken, unstable, from an abusive background model. I had a fantastic background, has always been surrounded by great men. My father, my brother, friends, cousins, work colleagues, and I'd never been treated as anything less than an equal. I'd never been. If anything, I was given far more leeway, far more opportunity, and probably there was less expectation of me. So it didn't, what I was being told in the literature about what a victim looked like as a woman just didn't tally with me. And that question led me to think, well, if it doesn't tally with me, what else is missing in this area? And that's how I started to suddenly come across information with male victims. And of course, my lead supervisor is Professor Nicola Graham Kevin, who is a leading light in this arena as far as female aggression and male victims are concerned. So although she didn't force me down that path, there was a little nudge now and again that just said, how about looking at this data, or how about looking at this paper? And of course, you pick up one paper and that veil is gone. You pop that red pill and off you go.
Indeed.
But yeah, so it came from a purely selfish investigation, and yet here I am now sat on an amazing study that I did over the early lockdown in the UK, which has developed into this one on coercive control.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found from that first study or first survey?
Yeah, it was a really big questionnaire as far as questionnaires go, but I was utterly exploiting the fact that the world had gone into lockdown. And I thought, well, if there's ever an opportunity to get a lot of men locked into a room scrolling through electronic devices, now is the time. And so literally as soon as Boris announced that we were going into lockdown, I sat on my bed and just scrawled out a kind of, if I was able to craft a survey with as many questions as possible, what would it look like? And then put that in through our ethics as soon as I could. And of course, that bounces back and forth a couple of times, but they were absolutely amazing considering that the universities had gone into lockdown and everything else. They were really thorough, but really efficient about getting me ethical clearance. So, like you said, I popped this out. It was just in English. I put it out. But within the survey, there was 4 psychological scales that gives me a snapshot of a male victim's journey. So it asks questions about the behaviours that happened in the relationship, the abusive behaviours. And that was a scale that was developed by my professor called the controlling behaviour scale. And that's based on Murray Strauss's controlling tactics scale.
Right.
So conflict tactics scale. So that was in there. So that gave me the sort of start point to what the abuse looked like. Then it had something called the brief coping, which looks at 14 different coping mechanisms. And some of those can be what we frame as positive coping mechanisms, like planning and reaching out for help and those kind of things. But also other things that can be either a cause or a negative effect of domestic abuse, like self-medicating with alcohol, increased smoking, or all those kind of elements. And then I looked at post-traumatic symptomology in the impact of events scale, and that doesn't measure PTSD per se, but it measures all the symptoms that could indicate you're at risk of getting PTSD. And then the final one, which is a real focus for my PhD as a theme, was I put something called the post-traumatic growth inventory in there, which looks to try to measure any positive adaptation. So what I'm trying to get a view of there was what happens with abuse, how that has a negative impact, how you might use coping mechanisms, and then hopefully how you levels of positive adaptation. But also, and this, oh, sorry, go on, Tom.
I was just going to say, you got me on pins and needles. What did you find?
Well, the literature, previous literature, which is completely dominated by the feminist narrative, has a number of myths. And that was, although those 4 scales were massive, that was only one part of a huge 4 questions. But in and of itself, that one of the myths that we're used to hearing from feminists, if they admit that men can be victims, is that men don't feel the same negative effects as women, you know. And it's that same old mantra as women most affected. So we're used to seeing that narrative. However, so that, and literally that's why I wanted to test the negative effects on men. And so out of the men that completed that particular scale, and it was over 1,000, because some people don't fit, there was no pressure to absolutely fill out each of these questions. It was literally left to the men that were completing it. But it was over 1,000 people that had filled in this scale, and half of them had reached a score level that would be of clinical concern if you went to see a doctor. And so there we're already talking 50% of men are feeling negative effect. But out of, again, the total, a third of men were scoring, attaining scores that would indicate a negative effect that could suppress the immune system for even more than 10 years after the event. So this wasn't just psychological impact. This was a psychobiological impact that could be indicated here, which completely blows out that myth of men don't get affected as much as women. And it is not dependent on the length of time they were in the relationship or the length of time they left the relationship. But it is looking like, and I'm still crunching data on this, that it's absolutely dependent on the level of abuse that those men sustained. So there's a positive correlation coming with the severity of the abuse with the severity of the negative impact, which is, again, common sense, but no one's tested men at this level. So all of a sudden, what that says to me is that we shouldn't start looking at providing services that are based on gender. We need to start providing services based on psychological need.
And severity.
And yes, absolutely, and severity. So that was that part, but there was other myths that I'd kind of asked questions about, because another myth that you hear from the gendered model is very much men don't feel fear. You know, men don't get as frightened as women. It's women that get really fearful of losing their lives or of men and this kind of stuff. So I'm a very plain speaker, if no one has heard me up into this point.
We've heard you.
So, I asked the question, were or are you frightened of your partner or ex-partner? And 76% of men said yes. Now, some of those men, some of the themes that were coming through from the qualitative data was around psychological impact, physical impact, because a lot of the experiences that were coming through from physical abuse were showing that women weaponize. And I'm really not exaggerating when I say this. There was times when I was reading this data And I'm an immersive researcher. I look at it and I become it. I can't express to you how I live and breathe this data.
Yes.
And there was times when I was furious at some of the experiences that these men had been through. There was times when I was heartbroken and crying, and it even makes me emotional now thinking about it. And there was times when I felt physically sick, and there was every range of those emotions just reading this data. And there's a few cases that really stay with you. So for example, in the post-traumatic symptomology, there's a question about sleep patterns, because obviously stress affects sleep, and then it becomes a cyclical, like a self-fulfilling prophecy. You can't sleep, so you can't deal with stress, and so on and so forth. And he was having real difficulty sleeping. So I tracked back through his data, and he had left his partner 10 years ago. But what came apparent was the reason he couldn't sleep was that his partner would disturb his sleep, but not because she would just go and wake him up, but she would wake him up by pouring a boiling kettle on him.
Oh, jeez.
So for me, it's almost normal that he would have that response, because the body goes into survival mechanism, as you'll know, Tom, that the body will keep that because it's had to survive by not going into a deep sleep so that it can escape being hit with boiling water.
Yes.
So there's various things like that. So when we're frightened of being physically harmed, and it didn't matter what size they were or anything else, that you can't do much when you're asleep and someone's pouring boiling water over you. I don't care how big you are. There was men that were frightened that they were going actually insane because they felt like they were being tormented. But the key difference between what I found and what I'm reading in the literature is men were terrified that if they left their abuser, the abuse would then be transferred on the children, because they knew they would lose the relationship with their children.
Right.
And again, one of the cases that stays with me was, there's a gentleman, and I call him that because he was an older gentleman, and there's a part of me that's how I was brought up. And he'd only left the relationship within a year or two, but he'd stayed in that relationship for 37 years. And again, when I track back in his data, I ask questions like, what prevented you from leaving, or what made you stay? And what he said was, he had to wait until his youngest daughter had left home, and she'd recently got married and left home, and she was safe and stable. And then he was able to leave because he knew that his abusive wife couldn't then rain that terror onto the children.
Right.
And that's a distinct difference between male and female victims, because as we know, women tend to get the primary parent role in any court system, and even expected by society. But men in that position are not always frightened for themselves, but they are terrified for the harm that might be put onto the children.
Yes.
And the other thing that I find amusing is that the bullshit concept of toxic masculinity is, and often you'll hear that, well, men don't reach out for help. Yeah, we hear that all the time. Men commit suicide at high rates because they don't reach out for help. It's toxic masculinity. So I ask the question, have you ever reached out for help? 85% of men said yes.
Wow.
So, but a lot of that was less formal areas they'd reached out to. So they'd reached out to the friends, they'd reached out to family, they'd reached out to work colleagues. And those that had reached out for what I'd labelled formal elements, they tended to categorise as solicitors or their GP, their doctor, their family doctor. They hadn't reached out to a domestic abuse shelter because they didn't. And I asked why not? And they said, well, who's going to believe us? There's nothing there for us. No one cares about us.
Right.
But then I asked the question of those that had said no, they hadn't reached out. And again, when I said to them, why haven't you? They said, well, and there's phrases that you can feel the emotion in that are very simple, but you can absolutely feel it, where men were saying, I'm 6'1", so who's going to believe I'm abused?
Right.
But from the qualitative data that came through was a lot of coercive control. And that's, again, in the UK, that became law in December 2015. And I think Australia are just debating this now, whether to have a coercive control law. And part of that previous survey, 212 men from Australia had answered that. And they had a few distinctive differences. So the across the whole survey, there was no real significant difference across age, across occupation, and indeed across culture. But there was a real skew towards computing and computer science bases. But that's probably because we had a huge proportion of people from India, where computing and computer services are a really leading industry. But also I'd released this survey online, so you're going to get a skew that way anyway. But in Australia, the occupation that got the most amount of Australian participants was construction. And again, that does not fit the narrative that, you know, these brickies and these what they call tradies in Australia are reaching out and answering a female researcher's questions and being really open and honest. So, but again, it was all there was a huge amount of physical violence, don't get me wrong, but the coercive violence that came through led me to start thinking, let's go back through the literature again and see what you can find, Debs. And there isn't much pre the sort of 2010 onto 2015. And then, of course, when it became law, there's a little bit of a flourish of research. And guess what? It's all on female victims of coercive control.
No.
With a lot of assumptions that says women are disproportionately affected by this without asking any men the question.
Yeah.
So,
I remember when that became law, and a lot of men on Twitter that I communicate with said, this is really interesting. And this may mean that the narrative will shift because men know that women practice a lot of coercive control. You could even say that's the primary MO of a lot of abusive women. So some men were somewhat hopeful at that time that the idea of coercive control would put domestic violence in a slightly different light and would allow male victims' voices to be heard. And I was very skeptical at the time, because I don't see that, you know, just because the definition has changed, that feminist attitudes about all men always being perpetrators and all women always being innocent victims is going to change. And I don't suppose it has. But yeah, I'd be interested in hearing how feminists have responded to the idea of coercive control and what it's meant in the UK for that, to have that law.
Well, I think we've had a couple of cases of extreme coercive control from female perpetrators to men, but they are written off as outliers. And I share that same hypothesis that the men that have reached out to you do, which is, I think this is an opportunity to really expose the levels of abuse that are perpetrated by women. Now, I in no way make any excuse for any kind of abuse, but I do think this narrative is also means that female perpetrators may not even know that that's perpetration, because we've normalized this level of behavior for women. So if to give you an idea, if a woman is given the silent treatment and ignored by a man, in coercive control language, it would be phrased as a withholding affection, and that's classed as abusive. And we know it is in intimate relationships, even in family relationships. If you withhold attention from a child, it's very coercive. Same if it's a woman and that's being held from them by a man. So I put a question in my survey: is sex withheld as a form of punishment? So I think sex for a lot of men is the equivalent of affection for women. There's a lot of men that feel love through the physical act of sex, and what's coming through just on the view that I've got at the minute is that yes, it is. I think this morning, if you bear with me, find it, 47% of men indicated that sex was withheld as punishment, either often or always.
Jeez.
in just starting. So I think we have to, it gives us an opportunity to expose the levels of what could be considered normal behavior for women. Yeah. And I know that sounds terrifying, but I do think this, because I put questions in about controlling your electronic devices and monitoring you on social media. And this was because, again, it's pretty much common sense, but there's a lot of this came through from my previous survey, and men talk to me on Twitter and social media and stuff. So let me find out. Monitoring your social media feed as of this morning, 51% said often or always.
Wow.
So there's stopping you going out with friends and family, 56%. Often or always. You know, there's some controlling who you see, 63%. And we all know that isolation is the first step of crushing someone's spirit, because you've got no way to relate your world, you've got no one to talk to, and it creates that element of hatred and dependency, that codependency. Actually, just while you're on, showing what a bit of a geek I am, but the present model of coercive control was put forward by Evan Stark. Yeah, he put forward this idea that there's a model of coercive control, but that was lifted completely from a guy called Biderman who in 1957. Do you know this? Do you know where it came from? No. So in 1957, Albert Biderman created, and you won't be able to see this, but I'll send it if anyone's interested. I have this pinned in my office. He created this chart here that I'll just read out the titles. And it was based on research of male prisoners of war in Japanese prisoners of war camps. And I'm going to read through the sections that he identified, and you'll recognize this. So there's isolation, monopolization of perception, humiliation and degradation, exhaustion, threats, demonstration of omnipresence, forcing trivial demands, and occasional indulgences. Now, this is exactly what coercive control is, but it was hijacked and made into something that could be, well, actually, as a model, it works for domestic abuse. However, it's not only dependent on your gender, as is anything. And it was actually created for male prisoners of war in Japanese prisoners of war camps. And it's classed as such a torture that here's that same model in this book. And this book is the Amnesty International Report on Torture from 1973. So this is how far back this framework goes. But one of the first elements is isolation. And it seems from my information that's coming through that isolation is a big tool that is used by women in order to control men.
Yes.
Now, it also is a big tool for men to control women.
Correct.
But it's the same. It can't just be applied to one of the genders. It is something that is used by abusers. That is it.
There you go.
There is no gender difference here.
Amen.
Deborah, I think there's also a problem, isn't there, in just sort of sorting out and recognizing some of this behavior based on the sex of the alleged perpetrator. I know, for instance, for many years working in residential treatment centers for alcoholism and drug abuse, we would get families in. The male would be the identified problem, the drinker. But then as we start working with the family, we notice a huge amount of coercive control from the mother, from the wife in that family. And in many cases, unfortunately, the treatment team would become an extension of her control over him. And confronting that, and again, when I tried to confront this in those settings, I was not only up against the resistance of the family to identifying part of the real problem, but also resistance from my colleagues.
Right.
Yes.
And they're saying we're identifying the wrong problem. Right. And so this seems to me to be inordinately challenging, especially given the propensity of women to more utilize relational aggression in relationships than men do.
Right.
But all of this gets sort of, it gets muddled and becomes invisible. And we often, even in the mental health field, become enablers of that kind of coercive control in relationships.
I think it's because of a number of factors, but we tend to see anyone that's using a substance as being maladaptive and as far as domestic abuse is concerned, you will find that addiction is, or overuse of any kind of substance is demonstrated both in a perpetrator and in a victim. So what happens there is but because of the way the narrative works and the way our brain is set up, if we see a woman that's drinking, we will assume that she's doing it as a coping mechanism and she's a victim. And if a man's doing it, we will just automatically assume that he's a perpetrator and an alcoholic and a bad guy. And that's not to say that those two models don't exist, but my advice to anyone that's in that situation is just pretend for the moment that didn't exist and have a look at the other dynamics that are going on in a relationship. Who's doing what? Who's speaking the most? Who's taking more of the control of the situation? And control doesn't mean overtly saying to someone, tell me exactly what's going on, or I will tell you what's going on. Because what abusers, and particularly charismatic abusers, are good at is making you feel that they aren't controlling a situation. And I know that, and I'll use you as an example, Paul. If you and I went somewhere and you were asking for help and I was asking for help, and I'm 5'1" and quite small, and I can do that kind of, please help me, I'm a damsel in distress, I'm likely to get people listening to me and doing what I want far more than you are, because you represent a challenge to them where I don't in physical terms. And evolution tells us that that's what we do. We have a gamma bias. But I think when you're treating people, there needs to be training that's put in place that says, we have a gamma bias and you need to be aware of this. This isn't the unconscious bias that we're hearing all the crap about at the minute. This is actually a built-in evolutionary bias that we know about. It's quite obvious. But the other thing is that women know this as well, and we know how to exploit it. And I've said this time and time again. I know in my home, I can dictate the mood of my house in a click. It is seriously, I can walk in the door, and if I'm in a mood and the house is a mess and blah blah blah, literally my family will scurry around trying to make it great for me until I go, oh, sorry guys, it's not you, I've had a shitty day, blah blah blah, all the rest of it. And most women are powerful in their own home, And to not admit that is a lie. You know, and I'm not negating all the women that are victims of male perpetrated or female perpetrated domestic abuse. Believe me, I've lived that life where I've had no power, whether I've been in the house or out of the house, and been utterly controlled. But as a population, we have a power, and as a population, we benefit from gamma bias.
Yeah.
I've seen that in play. I remember some years ago, I watched a lengthy program that studied couples who had made it past 50 years of marriage.
Okay.
And what I noticed when they asked the men over and over again, to what do you attribute success of this relationship? Their answers repeatedly were to give her whatever she wanted. And of course,
happy wife, happy life.
Yes, and the subtext of that being is that we will succeed as long as she's in control. And that is a very potent and powerful message that we're now lauding in relationships that make it past 50 years as a great success.
Yeah. So we're normalizing that, aren't we? We're normalizing the subjugation of men. Horrible. Yes, exactly. Who wants that? And again, I have 2 biological children, one of which is a son who is 14, and I also have 2 stepsons. One's 15, one's 12, and I now feel that horror of the consent issues that are all based about men trying to get consent off girls. You know, I'm literally terrified about which universities to go to and all this kind of stuff about how is this going to play out. I have no worries about my daughter at all. She's sound. She you know, like I have with all the kids, that made them aware of, don't go out and get absolutely drunk, not because you're a girl or a boy, but because there are people out there that will take advantage of you. Take some responsibility for your own behavior and don't think the world has to kind of morph itself around you. And I've got no concerns at all for my daughter in that respect. But I'm terrified for the boys. I'm absolutely terrified, because I'm thinking all it takes is someone to start casting that one accusation, and we all go, well, mud sticks, there's no smoke without fire, and all this kind of crap. We know how it works.
Yep.
And that's one of my boys' lives devastated.
Yes.
And I think women really need to have a think about that. If you've got boys and you think this is all fine and it's never going to happen to me, no, have a think about your saying this. Have a think about being a mother bear or lioness or whatever, and scream about it, shout about it, point at it, make sure people are aware of it. Not with my boy, you don't. Thank you very much. Not going to happen.
Yep. Right on.
You know, God help it. God help anyone who makes an accusation against my boys.
Good for you.
But I think we need to take.
I wish more fathers have that resolve.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think women have a golden ticket here, because we can't be saying to be, well, I get called a misogynist all the time, and there's a drive to have a misogyny hate law in the UK. And I constantly say on Twitter, when someone's called me a misogynist, I wonder if I'm going to be the first woman to ever be put in prison for having internalized misogyny. You know, it's absolute bullshit again. But
that brings up something I did want to ask about today, Deborah. There are pioneers before you that cut into the feminist narrative, people like Aaron Pitsey and Richard Gels and Suzanne Steinmetz and Murray Strauss, all of them involved in research that contradicted the feminist narrative in one way or another, and all of them got death threats, bomb threats, and were subject to being attacked. Have you experienced, I know you've experienced hostility because of what you do. I'm just curious about how much and how far it's gone.
Yeah, it's got there. I've had one death threat up to now. But I get a lot of just people being really vicious, and there's a number of things that I don't take it personally, because I see all of this as research. That's not to say it doesn't concern me, because some of these people are absolutely vicious, and I don't mean just the ones that call me pick me or misogynist or whatever, but people that are actually vicious and tell me things that should happen to me or should happen to my kids or whatever, or even things that are hurtful just at a stinging level, where people say to me, I can understand why he beat you, about my previous relationship and stuff, but I'm actually going to use that as evidence and publish it. I'm going to publish the fact.
Very good.
And I must say, that level of abuse comes from women. As far as I'm aware, I've never had that physical threat or hurtful psychological threat from a man. There was one particular academic that tried to, shall we say, get me cancelled, which I saw off. But other than that, it's been women, and it's been women that are self-identified as feminist. Now, my hypothesis around that is some of them are hateful and just nasty people. Some of them may well be perpetrators, or at least have been involved in bi-directional perpetration of abuse. And some of them have been brainwashed, and they are brainwashed at such a level, and I've come along and not only shaken their worldview about what's been presented to them, but I've also highlighted that those people that have been giving them this information have lied. So they've been betrayed as well. Right. But they're attacking me because I'm the person that's just launched this on them. And just like you do when you pick your kids up from school and they've been well behaved all day, and then when they hit you, you get all the bad behavior because they can release that and you're a safe bet.
Yes.
I'm getting that level of reaction because I'm the person that's suddenly gone, and here's a nice red pill for you to swallow. So
they don't go down easy sometimes.
Yeah, I was going to say, don't choke.
No, it takes a while. But there's things like people saying, I can understand why he did that to you, or people saying to me, you don't sound like a victim, which again just highlights to me that they've got this view of what a victim should sound like. And I ask the question, so what does a victim sound like? And
really?
They can't answer that question, and they just call me other names. But
that's good.
But it's really, it's from a research perspective, it's really fascinating because it highlights the level of cognitive distortions. And you know, I put that blog out last year, 7 Reasons Why Feminism Needs CBT. These are the kind of behaviors that highlight that issues that I myself have been to counseling and CBT because of what happened to me, and had to go through this toolkit of, am I thinking logically, or have I got my distortions coming in from that? And I've been given those toolkits through counseling. And again, this is one of the reasons why I despise the gendered model, because it makes excuses for that kind of thinking and feeds it rather than deals with it and leave people to heal and flourish. It keeps them in that victim box and then feeds all the distortions that they're thinking.
Yes.
And that's horrible. That doesn't help female victims yet.
And that's what you're dealing with, and that's part of why I admire you so, is your willingness to stand in that mess and to stand in your tension with it. Good for you.
Well, I actually had a conversation with Erin Pitsey years ago now, when I first met her, and she put that to me, like, I started this 50 years ago next year now, and here we are having the same battle. And I said, well, I think it's because we've been battling in their arena. We've walked into their space and tried to battle everything that they've already presented. And Erin said, yes, absolutely. And I said, I'm not going to bother with their arena. I'm just going to build my own and let them come to our door. I'm not stepping into that lion's den. I'm just going to board it up and let them fight amongst themselves. And meanwhile, while they're all having this battle, I'll just build something completely different.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that's what these surveys are doing. They're allowing us to build something. And I push this data out all the time. I spread it so that this gives it back to the people that need it. I'm not keeping this for me. This is not my precious jewel. This is something that I need to process, need to make sure if it's statistically significant, and then hand it back to the people that need it.
And I hope we can help you spread it. You know,
Absolutely.
We'll certainly have a link in the description area of where you can take this survey.
Fantastic.
Men out there, we need you to take this, to give Deborah the ammo, you know, that shows what's really going on, you know, what's really going on, to help her build her arena. You know, I like that.
Yes.
I like that. Yeah. We're going to help you build that damn arena and get that thing stable.
So part of that arena is going to be built by, after I'd been that senior academic had a go, I actually went on to an interview with Bettina Arndt in Australia, who's an advocate for men out there.
Yes.
And as a consequence of that interview, a private backer came forward and asked me what I needed to do a survey. And I said, I'm about to do another survey. I was literally, myself and Nikki were pulling this coercive control one together. I said, but what I do need is a decent website that I can put on all the relevant data. I can put on videos of people that are victims, frontline service providers, academics, politicians, and literally where everyone can go to take a look at this data and take that data with them to present to their teams and to train with other people and stuff. And we're doing it.
Do you know the URL? You know the domain name?
But it's not. I bought the URL, so I want it to be. In a previous life, before I got back in psychology, I did sales and marketing. So I wanted it to be so simple that it became part of the vernacular. It became part of normal language. So I bought the domain name, the Male Victim Study, and that's going to be it.
Nice.
Excellent. So if there's any interested web developers out there that would like to assist in a project like that, we will very much appreciate your reaching out to us so that we can get with Deborah. This is information that must get out there and stay out there for years to come. And of course, you know, like all the other great research, and there has been some really good research done in the past, the effort from the feminist establishment will be to bury it and to discredit Deborah and to do all the nasty things they're used to doing with research that doesn't fit their narrative. Yep. But guess what? The internet is the great equalizer. We can have that stuff out there and we can pass it along to people for years and years to come. We just need a home for it. So web developers, time for some service work.
Absolutely. And the other thing I've done, and hopefully Nikki will come on board when she can as well, is I've committed to repeating this every 2 years. And it's the survey will be organic in as much as the feedback that I get from the data in the surveys and the feedback from people saying, have you thought of this question, or could you translate it into this language, or could you do this, will help this survey develop. But every 2 years we will repeat this and get new data out there, build on this foundation so that we end up having a system and arena that is so large and so distributed through the internet that you're going to get challenged. So you might as well come and use our resource if you're doing domestic abuse services, because I want it to become so well known that if you produce a bit of data and you want a policy to change on it, and you haven't included men, I want the challenge back to that person to be, have you referenced the male victim study? And if not, why not?
There you go.
Absolutely.
And we get to that point where we get so big and it's so simple. There's nothing complicated about this. Yes, I do all the analysis in the back room, as it were, but all the stories that go out there on the front of this website need to be easily understood and easily digested, and more importantly, easily utilized.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Indeed. Are
So
we
I
about
think
there?
we arm everybody with this data.
Right.
And so the next time someone's on Twitter and they get hit with a, well, women are more frightened than men, they can say, no, actually, according to the male victim study, men are 76% blah, blah, blah.
Exactly. Exactly.
Excellent.
Absolutely right.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we are about to wrap up,
Yeah,
but I
it's
don't.
just-
I don't want to quit this without saying thank you
Really.
to Deborah, both for chatting with us today and for the amazing work that
Yes.
you've been doing.
I second
Mhm. Yes,
Very
me too.
that. Yeah. You're definitely appreciated.
Thank you. It's an absolute passion. And I was saying to Tom before, I've only got the data set I have because men have trusted me with their stories, and that's an absolute honor.
Yeah. Amen. Good. And we always end by saying men
Are
Good.
I thought Janice was going to forget.
Never.
well, she knew it was either good or bad. She had to take a moment.
All right. Thanks again, Deborah. Really appreciate it. And we'll see you guys next week.
Deborah,
Thank
All
you.
right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Fantastic.
Bye.
Bye-bye.